If you've watched any news during the coronavirus crisis, you've all but certainly heard one man's name quite a bit.
New York Governor Andrew Cuomo joins us now.
Andrew Cuomo.
Andrew Cuomo. New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo.
Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York and the current face of the coronavirus response. With the pandemic hitting his state harder than any other, Cuomo has been thrust into the national spotlight and has hardly discouraged his newfound media attention.
To do Ellen's show was a pleasure for me. I'm a big fan of Ellen. Yes, she said nice things about me.
Yes, she did.
From late night, to social media, to sparring with his brother on CNN primetime.
For the record, I do a lot of interviews. Nobody is more probing, annoying, and disrespectful than you are.
Andrew Cuomo seems to be everywhere you look. But who is the governor of New York, really? What was he doing before he was holding coronavirus briefings on a daily basis? And why has his state led the nation, and even sometimes the world, in cases? Let's take a look. Andrew Cuomo, the eldest son of famed New York Governor Mario Cuomo, began his career working in his father's administration, then went on to serve as Assistant Secretary, then Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under Bill Clinton. By 2006, he had turned his attention back to New York state politics, winning election as the state's Attorney General. Cuomo was elected Governor of New York in 2010 and won re-election campaigns in 2014 and 2018. During his time as governor, Cuomo has helped to pass a same-sex marriage law, increase gun control, and raise the state minimum wage. However, his administration has also been plagued by accusations of corruption despite Cuomo's seemingly strong stance on the issue as a candidate. Multiple top Cuomo aides have been convicted on charges throughout his years in office, from bribery to fraud to conspiracy, begging the question, how deep does the corruption in Andrew Cuomo's administration go? Cuomo announced his campaign for governor in 2010 with a scathing speech on the corruption plaguing New York State's government, calling it disreputable, discredited, and a national disgrace.
The New York State government was at one time a national model. Now, unfortunately, it's a national disgrace. Sometimes the corruption in Albany could even make Boss Tweed blush. In my opinion, politicians of both parties, Democrats and Republicans, share the blame. And that's why today I announce my candidacy for the governor of the state of New York. My campaign is not going to be about me, but we.
After his election, Cuomo launched the Moreland Commission to investigate public corruption. The commission began its work in July 2013, but found themselves in hot water with the governor's office just 2 months later after issuing a subpoena to Buying Time, a New York media buying firm with ties to Cuomo. Once news of the subpoena reached the governor's office, the rebuke came swiftly. Senior Cuomo aide Lawrence Schwartz called William Fitzpatrick one of the Moreland Commission's co-chairs. Schwartz informed Fitzpatrick that Buying Time worked for the governor and ordered him to call off the subpoena. "This is wrong," Fitzpatrick says he was told at the time. "Pull it back." Shortly after the phone call, the subpoena was withdrawn. The panel's chief investigator later confirmed that the investigation was halted because the firm in question had worked for the governor. This incident was one example of a pattern of interference from the governor's office that investigators on the Moreland Commission encountered when attempting to look into groups tied to Cuomo. Halfway through the 18-month timeframe the governor had laid out for the Moreland Commission, Cuomo passed a set of modest ethics reforms far below what the commission recommended and ordered the group disbanded. Why was a governor who launched his campaign by declaring a fight against corruption threatened by his own commission? In the coming years, those answers would start to emerge. Todd Howe, a longtime Cuomo family aide, initially worked for Governor Mario Cuomo in the 1980s, then later Andrew from the 90s onward. He spent more than 30 years as a lobbyist and Cuomo aide until pleading guilty to 8 felonies in 2016, on charges from fraud to embezzlement to extortion. During his time working for Andrew Cuomo, Howe was responsible for courting big money donors for the governor. He organized fundraising events for Cuomo to meet and socialize with executives interested in doing business with New York State, and facilitated connections between the governor's staff and lobbyists for various industries. If someone wanted to get in Andrew Cuomo's ear, Todd Howe was the man to help him do it. He encouraged donors to line up behind Cuomo, quote, so that the governor's office would know and remember them. And decisions made by the administration show just how far these donations went. Take the Buffalo Billion Project as an example. Announced in 2012 by Cuomo, the program was designed to promote economic development and sustainable energy in the Buffalo, New York area. As the project's name suggests, the governor of New York aimed to invest $1 billion in the program. and one of the main people responsible for helping to distribute that investment was Dr. Alain Caballeros, a physicist from the State University of New York. Shortly after his appointment, Caballeros teamed up with Todd Howe to ensure that many of the project's most lucrative development contracts went to firms headed by Cuomo donors. The two steered hundreds of millions of dollars in state funding to the same donors that Howe promised would be known and remembered by the governor's office. Caballeros' conviction of wire fraud and conspiracy in 2018 cast further suspicion on a governor whose administration had already been haunted by charges of corruption, with many New Yorkers finding it difficult to believe that Cuomo was unaware of his aide's illicit activities. Or, as his primary opponent, actress Cynthia Nixon, said,
"If you look at the incredible corruption in his administration, particularly where his economic development is concerned, and I'm not an Albany insider like Governor Cuomo, but I think that experience doesn't mean that much if you're not actually good at governing."
But perhaps the most significant documented instance of corruption in the Cuomo administration came in the case of Joseph Percoco, a longtime Cuomo family friend and aide who managed Andrew Cuomo's 2010 and 2014 campaigns for governor. Cuomo even once characterized Percoco as his father's third son. In 2018, Percoco was convicted of soliciting and accepting bribes as well as conspiracy to commit fraud. The charges stemmed from his involvement in the approval process of a natural gas-fueled power plant in Orange County, New York. The plant, owned by energy company Competitive Power Ventures, or CPV, was approved by the Cuomo administration in 2014 despite the opposition of environmental groups and many local residents. In 2018, as part of a cooperation deal with state prosecutors, Todd Howe testified that he had helped to arrange for CPV to pay Percoco almost $300,000 through a payment to his wife, shortly before the Cuomo administration gave final approval for the plant to be built. Since that plant became operational, Orange County residents have complained of a long list of health problems, including headaches, burning eyes and noses, coughing, and stomach aches.
My question is, how are you going to face your neighbors and your kids who are coughing their brains out when they say to you, your job actually caused this?
People who live near the plant say they frequently witness plumes of smoke rising from the site, and nitrogen oxide emissions in the area have spiked. Recently, Orange County, already struggling with respiratory and other health issues, has been devastated by the coronavirus pandemic in New York, with the county recording the 6th highest death rate in the state. Over the past 4 years, Todd Howe, Alain Caballeros, and Joseph Percoco have all been convicted of felonies resulting from corruption. Did the illegal activities of these men have anything to do with Andrew Cuomo's decision to shut down his own corruption commission? Plenty of New Yorkers seem to believe so, recording Cuomo with a staggeringly low 34% job approval rating by late 2019. In one of the safest blue states in the country, the people of New York gave the same approval to their Democratic governor as they did to President Donald Trump. But in early 2020, everything changed. On March 1st, 2020, a healthcare worker in Manhattan became the first person in the state of New York to be diagnosed with COVID-19. Governor Andrew Cuomo, echoing federal officials, downplayed the virus's potential.
They have symptoms. The symptoms are similar to what you would have with a normal flu. And for most people, they treat themselves.
In the ensuing days, officials in New York continued to assure people that risk of an outbreak was low, with Cuomo boasting about the state government's response and New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio riding the subway across the city in an effort to encourage people to go out and about.
You have to have direct contact, so even if someone's on a train, it doesn't hang in the air.
But by March 7th, less than 1 week after the first confirmed case in New York, the case count reached 89 and Governor Cuomo declared a state of emergency.
I have officially done a declaration of emergency, which gives us certain powers.
Despite the quickly escalating crisis, officials were still reluctant to impose significant closures across the state. Cuomo allowed public schools to remain open for more than a week after declaring the state of emergency, finally announcing their closure on March 16th. By that point, there were more than 2,000 cases of coronavirus in New York. Cuomo also shut down bars, restaurants, movie theaters, gyms, and casinos on the 16th, but the situation was already spiraling out of control. On March 17th, after weeks of pressure from his aides, Mayor Bill de Blasio announced that he was considering imposing a stay-at-home order in New York City.
In my view, I think the right guidance to give all New Yorkers is, even though a decision has not yet been made by the city or by the state, I think New Yorkers should be prepared right now for the possibility of a shelter-in-place order.
The governor's office fired back almost immediately, saying that there was no consideration of that for any locality at this time. Why would Cuomo and de Blasio go back and forth during a crisis like this? Weren't there more important things to worry about? If you're asking those questions, you probably aren't too familiar with the history between Bill de Blasio and Andrew Cuomo. De Blasio and Cuomo have crossed paths plenty of times throughout their political careers, most notably when de Blasio worked for the Department of Housing and Urban Development in the 1990s while Cuomo was the department's secretary. While it is not unusual for tensions to exist between the governor of New York State and the mayor of New York City, upon de Blasio taking office as mayor in 2014, he and Cuomo have engaged in a feud for the ages. From arguing over topless women in Times Square, to Cuomo shutting down New York City subways without notifying de Blasio, to the two trading barbs over napping habits, and even a 2-day standoff over whether to euthanize a deer. True story, look it up. There has been seemingly nothing that Bill de Blasio and Andrew Cuomo can't fight over, New York's coronavirus response efforts included. So back to March 17th. De Blasio's consideration of a stay-at-home order was dismissed by Cuomo's office and the following day by the governor himself.
Looks like New York is going to essentially order a shelter-in-place condition, which means basically you can't leave your house. What more is coming?
Yes. That is not going to happen, shelter-in-place. For New York City or any city or county to take an emergency action, the state has to approve it. And I wouldn't approve shelter-in-place.
Just days later, on March 20th, Cuomo reversed course and issued a stay-at-home order for the state of New York.
So we're going to put out an executive order today. New York State on pause. Only essential businesses can have workers commuting to the job or on the job. Second rule, remain indoors to the greatest extent to protect physical and mental health.
In the 3 days between de Blasio announcing his consideration of such an order and Cuomo issuing it, the state's case count tripled. As March wore on and the crisis continued to develop, an important date was looming. March 31st, the last day of the month, was the deadline for the legislature to pass a new state budget, and Cuomo saw an opportunity. The governor's office issued a set of demands corresponding to various political goals that Andrew Cuomo had long aimed to implement, from preventing tax hikes on the wealthy, to increasing his own budgetary authority, to rolling back restrictions on cash bail, a progressive victory from the year before. Cuomo even insisted on cutting billions of dollars in state Medicaid funding in the midst of a pandemic, and one of his top aides made it clear how far the governor was willing to go to accomplish these goals. On April 2nd, the legislature gave in to Cuomo's demands and passed the new state budget, allowing the Department of Health to remain open. In the 2 additional days past the budget deadline that Cuomo's office spent in a standoff with the legislature, more than 15,000 new coronavirus cases were confirmed in New York. With the budget situation addressed, Cuomo turned back to fighting with Bill de Blasio. On April 11th, de Blasio announced that New York City schools would remain closed for the rest of the academic year. Cuomo once again disputed de Blasio's authority on the matter.
You can't make a decision just within New York City without coordinating that decision with the whole metropolitan region. The mayor has an opinion on New York City.
Cuomo would eventually reach the same conclusion as de Blasio and close state schools for the remainder of the academic year, but not before parents, students, and teachers in New York City spent weeks trying to make sense of mixed messages and expressing their disappointment in their leaders' inability to work together, even during a crisis. Around the same time, the people of New York were dealt yet another blow. After initially postponing the state's Democratic presidential primary to late June, the New York Board of Elections, consisting entirely of Cuomo appointees, announced on April 27th that the primary would be canceled entirely. This came just days after Cuomo himself signed executive orders canceling 6 special elections, allowing some seats to remain open and in other cases allowing the incumbent to keep their seat for the foreseeable future. The Cuomo administration insisted that these cancellations were necessary to protect the public health. However, the governor himself had already signed an executive order guaranteeing voters the option to vote by mail. This will allow dozens of state and congressional primaries to proceed in New York this year. With that being the case, why was a total cancellation of the Democratic primary necessary? Almost 10% of the country's registered Democrats live in New York, meaning that a tenth of the party would not be able to vote in its presidential primary. In addition, progressive down-ballot candidates such as Jonathan Herzog, who is running to unseat Congressman Jerry Nadler in New York's 10th district, expressed concerns that canceling the presidential primary would depress turnout among left-wing voters, who tended to support candidates such as Bernie Sanders and Andrew Yang.
The way New York politics has been set up is there's different dates for elections, in part to try to diminish turnout.
Both Sanders and Yang had stated their desire to compete for delegates in New York's contest, and the latter quickly filed a lawsuit against the New York Board of Elections in an effort to preserve the presidential primary. Yang won the suit, with a judge declaring the cancellation unconstitutional. For now, the primary will proceed. But with Andrew Cuomo hinting at the possibility of filing an appeal, this dispute may be far from over. With New York beginning to reopen on May 15th and thousands of new confirmed cases still appearing daily, the state is entering a new stage of its fight against the coronavirus. Boosted by constant positive coverage by the mainstream media, Cuomo's approval rating among New Yorkers passed 80% in early May. Cuomo has clearly been enjoying his newfound popularity and has demonstrated little patience for those who have criticized his handling of the crisis.
Is there a fundamental right to work if the government can't get me the money when I need it? Is there a fundamental right
you want to go to work? Go take a job as an essential worker. Do it tomorrow.
New York has been hit harder than any other state in the country by the coronavirus outbreak. More than a quarter of those who have lost their lives to the pandemic have been from New York State. If New York were its own country, it would be second in cases only to the rest of the United States. Andrew Cuomo and his administration ignored warnings from medical experts in the early days of the outbreak, advice that former CDC Director Thomas Frieden says could have reduced the state's case count by 50 to 80%. The governor has utilized the pandemic to accomplish his long-standing political goals. And even as his state was experiencing increasing levels of hardship, Cuomo was unable to set aside previous political grudges. So why do more than 80% of New Yorkers say that they approve of Cuomo's handling of coronavirus? Why has #Cuomo2024 trended on Twitter in recent weeks? And what, in God's name, is a Cuomosexual? Cuomo owes a significant amount of his current political good fortune to another New Yorker. No, not Wendy Williams.
Our Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York.
Donald Trump. Trump's coronavirus briefings have been wild spectacles filled with medical inaccuracies, crackpot suggestions like injecting Americans with bleach, and Trump's typical feuds with figures like Mitt Romney and Barack Obama.
Right, and then I see the disinfectant, where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection?
Americans who are fearful of the coronavirus find little comfort in Trump's briefings, and the response of the president's supposed opposition is meager at best. Joe Biden's response to the pandemic has almost entirely consisted of the former vice president broadcasting questionably coherent messages from his basement and failing to provide an alternative plan of action. Also, for some reason, playing cards with Keegan-Michael Key.
Keegan, do you have any threes?
No, I don't. Do you have any nines?
Yeah.
The American public does not seem to have much faith in Donald Trump or Joe Biden, with both receiving negative approval ratings in late April, with Trump's disapproval at 52% and Biden's not much better at 41%. 35% of American voters also indicated their willingness to consider another option in the presidential race, showing a lack of confidence in both major candidates. Donald Trump's uncoordinated and ineffective response to the coronavirus pandemic has left Americans afraid and uncertain. Joe Biden's inability to provide strong opposition has left people unsure where to turn. Enter Andrew Cuomo. The governor's daily briefings, accompanied by neatly laid out slideshows, have provided a sense of comfort to many people looking for information during this crisis. His ability to show basic empathy and form complete sentences has excited voters whose standards have been repeatedly and constantly lowered throughout the past months and years. But there's a danger to labeling Cuomo a crisis hero without considering that his elevated platform during the pandemic is largely due to his own mishandling of the virus to the point where New York led the nation in cases. There's also danger in lowering our standards to the point where anyone who gets a little bit of media love is hailed as a political savior.
Trevor, you call yourself a Cuomosexual, and I agree with you. I feel like I'm a Cuomosexual too. Can I say that I am a Cuomosexual? You know that that's going around, that people are saying they're Cuomosexuals.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. I don't think it's a bad thing.
Let's just hope it doesn't go to his head.